What ended slavery in the West and in the Mediterranean, or who ended slavery? This great book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals, it's kind of told me something that I had already got a taste of in Niall Ferguson's work, particularly his book Empire, that it was essentially the British. And this is ironic because it's the Brits that get blamed for the slave trade more than any other country, until they have to be ashamed of their history and their culture. So the irony, I'm sure, will be completely lost on these people. But slavery has always been with us in every country, every society, every culture that there's ever been. Slavery has, as soon as there was people who could exert power and victimize other people, there's been slaves. They've always existed. Some slave trades were worse than others, but they've always been around. And there are some imbeciles that will say that slavery didn't exist before black Africans found themselves on a cotton plantation in the American South, which is just so unbelievably stupid, promulgated by the idiots that have never read a book in their lives, or dishonest left-wing academics that want people to believe this, but they know quite well that it's not true. The British did this not out of any kind of financial motive to themselves. This was a moral imperative brought on by the Enlightenment, brought on by certain Christian groups, notably the Quakers, the abolitionist movement. There was outrage about this in Britain itself by the common people. They were not on board with this kind of stuff. They were not on board with slavery at all, and of course it wasn't always like that. Although slavery has been outlawed in Britain since the early 12th century, about 50 years after the conquest. But there have been slaves in Britain, up in Scotland, up until the early 1800s, working in the coal mines. There have been slaves there. But the local people had a visceral response to stories about slavery, and the whole institution was becoming untenable on an ethical level. This cost the British a serious amount of money, and they have only got done paying it off about 8 years ago. It was about, a decade ago. It was about 2011 when they had finally paid up, because people had to be compensated. If you're going to take their slaves away, that is their property, essentially. It's a commodity. It's like if you steal someone's property, you got to pay for it. And the costs were so incredibly big and taxing, they just got through with paying them off very recently. Not only did they do this, they patrolled the Atlantic, the west coast of Africa. The Portuguese did not want to give up slavery in Brazil. Brazil had a lot more slaves than the United States even had. Most black slaves that went across the Atlantic from Africa didn't end up in America. They ended up in Haiti, Jamaica, Brazil. Had about 4 times as many black slaves as America, and they didn't want to give it up, and they had to be more or less forced to give it up, because the British would stop their boats and take their cargo, and their cargo was human beings, and they would set the slaves free. Most notably, the Ottomans dealt in slaves at this point in history, in the mid 19th century, where the European powers came to a general consensus. Some were quicker to do it than others, but there became a general feeling that this is wrong, and perhaps the institution should come to an end. There was no such compunction in the Muslim world about holding slaves. The Quran is very clear, although there is slavery in the Bible as well. It's vastly contradictory. The Quran, well, it justifies slavery to people who are not Muslim, so infidels. And the Ottomans didn't want to give it up. Why would they, in their opinion? This has been with us for the longest time. It served us quite well, and they didn't want to give it up, but the British made it untenable, essentially, for them. Not through violent means, but they had embargoes, and they had heavy taxes, and they just made life very uncomfortable for the Ottomans, because the British had such a strong navy. They essentially ruled the world at this time. So yeah, they got the Ottomans to give up slavery, but there were still de facto slave markets all across North Africa. White people were being sold in Egypt and at a market up until the 1890s. Same with black people. They enslaved everybody. It didn't matter the color of their skin. The Barbary pirates were out of business by then, thanks to Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. And that's a great story, I think for another time. But they completely flattened the shores of Tripoli in North Africa when they blatantly said they wouldn't give up the slave trade. But I think this just speaks to the absolute irony out there, is that the Brits get blamed for modern slavery, and it is the Brits that essentially ended slavery in the West. Why do they get no thanks for this? Why are they never taught about this? Are British children taught about this in school as a point of pride in their nation? That, oh, guess what? All societies held slaves, including us, but not all societies ended slavery. We did. We were the ones that did it. We were the progenitors of that movement, let's say. And I don't hear this being promulgated by anybody, really. And I certainly don't see it being taught to children. I could be wrong, but I've cause to doubt it in England and in Britain generally. I seriously doubt if this is being talked about. But it just speaks to what history is. It's the rough and the smooth. The British have done things that they should be ashamed of in their history. But they've also done things that they should be immensely proud of in their history. And they have, in my opinion, they have been a net benefit on the world. Every country has things they would be ashamed of, things they should be proud of. So maybe it's time for an honest conversation about